Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we stand before the God of the impossible, the one who speaks and dry bones rise, the one who commands light to break through the darkest night. Father, I come like a child who has nowhere else to run. You have seen my silent tears and heard the whispers of my weary heart. Stretch forth your mighty hand and do what no man can do. Turn my battles into testimonies, my delays into divine appointments, and let your power overshadow every impossibility standing before me. God specializes in turning impossibilities into realities. When we look at the world through human eyes, there are limits, boundaries, and constraints that seem insurmountable. There are situations where logic fails, where every avenue seems blocked, and where hope feels fragile. Yet, when we lift our eyes to the heavens and recognize the God we serve, we begin to understand that impossibility is merely a word created by human limitations, not by divine capability. From the beginning of time, God has demonstrated a pattern of turning what is impossible in the human realm into something undeniably real. He spoke the universe into existence from nothing, a vast expanse of stars, planets, and galaxies that defy human comprehension, showing that his capacity is unlimited. What he can do in the spiritual and material realms cannot be measured or restrained by the standards of the natural world. Time and again, the scriptures remind us that when circumstances seem hopeless, God's power is fully at work. Think of Abraham and Sarah, who were advanced in age and had long given up hope of having a child. Human reasoning would say that it was impossible, yet God's promise did not fail. Through divine intervention, the impossible became possible, and Isaac, the child of promise, came into existence. This demonstrates a critical principle. God is not limited by the obstacles we face, by the age of situations, or by the apparent finality of circumstances. The human mind sees impossibility. God sees opportunity to reveal his glory. When we grasp this truth, our perspective shifts. We begin to view challenges not as dead ends, but as canvases for divine creativity, as stages for God's miraculous intervention. When we consider the miracles of Jesus during his time on earth, the reality of God's ability to turn the impossible into reality becomes even more evident. The blind received sight, the lame walked, the dead were raised, and the storm obeyed his voice. Each of these events was a testimony that human limitations do not define God's boundaries. The leper, who was considered untouchable and hopeless, encountered healing at the hands of the one who makes a way where there seems to be none. The widow's son, who lay lifeless, was restored to life not by human skill, but by the authority of God. These accounts are not mere stories from the past. They are principles that still operate today. The God who healed, restored, and multiplied then is the same God who works in our lives now. Faith plays a critical role in accessing the impossible. It is not merely about acknowledging God's existence, but about trusting him to act where human efforts have failed. Faith is the bridge between the seen and the unseen, the natural and the supernatural. It allows us to release control from our hands and place it into God's, acknowledging that what we cannot do, he can. Abraham's in the life is an illustration of this principle. Though he waited years for the fulfillment of God's promise, he held on to faith, and God's timing brought about a reality that defied natural expectation. In the same way, when we encounter situations that defy logic, when doors seem permanently closed, and when human solutions are exhausted, faith becomes the key that unlocks divine possibilities. God's ability to turn the impossible into the possible is also evident in the experiences of ordinary people who encountered extraordinary breakthroughs. The woman with the issue of blood had spent years seeking healing, spending all her resources without success. The human diagnosis was failure, and despair could have easily taken root. Yet, she believed that touching the hem of Jesus' garment would change her reality. Her faith aligned with God's power, and what had been impossible for 12 long years was suddenly within reach. This principle remains consistent. God responds to the faith that moves beyond the visible, that refuses to settle for less, and that seeks his intervention in every impossibility. Prayer is the channel through which we invite God to demonstrate his power in impossible situations. When we kneel and pour out our hearts before him, we are engaging the very source of creation. Through prayer, we acknowledge that our abilities are limited and that only his power can bring resolution. It is in prayer that God's supernatural possibilities intersect with our natural limitations. Sometimes the answers do not come in the form we expect, but they always come in a form that fulfills his purpose and brings glory to his name. The psalmist declared, "With God all things are possible," a statement that challenges every mindset that confines God to human reasoning. Life constantly presents moments that seem impossible, relationships that appear broken beyond repair, finances that seem hopelessly insufficient, health crises that defy medical solutions, and dreams that have been postponed by relentless setbacks. Yet, each of these scenarios is a platform for God to manifest his power when we position ourselves in alignment with his will, when we trust in his promises, and when we refuse to surrender to despair. We create the conditions for impossibilities to transform into testimonies. Each challenge becomes an opportunity for God to reveal that he is not limited by time, space, or circumstance. Understanding that God specializes in turning impossibilities into realities requires a shift in mindset. It calls for a rejection of doubt and an embrace of expectation. It requires us to release the belief that human effort alone is sufficient, and to recognize that divine intervention is the ultimate solution. Throughout Scripture, God's pattern is clear. He delights in showing his power where human power ends, in creating outcomes that are unexplainable by natural means, and in demonstrating that nothing is too difficult for him. The story of Joseph illustrates this perfectly. From betrayal, imprisonment, and false accusations, his path seemed impossible. Yet God's favor orchestrated events, turning his trials into triumphs and his setbacks into a platform for global influence. When we internalize the truth that God specializes in the impossible, we begin to approach life differently. Challenges no longer evoke panic or despair. Instead, they inspire prayer, trust, and expectancy. We recognize that the magnitude of our problems is no match for the magnitude of God's power. What seems impossible in human eyes becomes a canvas for divine creativity, a stage for His glory to manifest, and a reason for us to maintain unwavering faith. The God who split the Red Sea, who brought down walls without human hands, and who fed multitudes with minimal resources, is the same God who stands ready to act in our lives today, turning every impossible situation into a living testimony of His greatness. Faith, patience, and trusting God's plan are critical components of this principle. The impossibilities we face are not indicators of defeat. They are opportunities for God's glory to be revealed. They are moments designed to elevate our faith, to draw us closer to Him, and to demonstrate that He alone is sufficient. When we surrender our limitations, doubts, and fears, we open the door for God's supernatural power to operate without restriction. What is impossible for man becomes possible for God, and those who trust Him witness miracles that surpass understanding, defy expectation, and transform lives in ways that only He can orchestrate. The human mind struggles to comprehend how divine power operates, yet history and scripture are full of examples where God's intervention shattered all natural constraints. The multiplication of loaves and fishes, the calming of storms, and the resurrection of the dead are not isolated events. They are principles that demonstrate God's consistent nature. Today, the same power is accessible to those who call upon Him in faith, pray without ceasing, and trust Him to act where human solutions fail. The essence of God's work is to make the impossible possible, to rewrite stories of despair into narratives of hope, and to transform challenges into milestones of His glory. When we live with the expectation that God specializes in the impossible, we no longer measure outcomes by human ability. We begin to see obstacles as invitations to witness divine intervention, delays as opportunities for perfect timing, and hardships as setups for miraculous breakthroughs. Each circumstance, no matter how daunting, carries within it the potential for God to display His unmatched power, to turn scarcity into abundance, sickness into health, bondage into freedom, and despair into joy. Those who embrace this truth walk through life with confidence, knowing that no situation is too complex, no challenge too great, and no impossibility too formidable for the God who orchestrates all things according to His will. Faith, prayer, and obedience create the conditions for God to intervene. When we align ourselves with His purposes, when we trust His timing, and when we refuse to settle for less than His best, impossibilities are transformed into realities. God delights in revealing His power in situations where human solutions fail, in answering prayers that seem hopeless, and in orchestrating outcomes that only His wisdom can design. Those who trust Him witness the extraordinary, experience breakthroughs, and become living testimonies of the God who specializes in turning impossibilities into realities. The principle is clear. No situation is beyond God's reach. From the smallest personal struggle to the most complex global challenge, His power remains limitless. He delights in taking what is impossible in the eyes of men and making it possible beyond imagination. Faith positions us to receive Prayer activates his intervention, and obedience aligns us with his plan. Every impossibility carries within it the seed of a miracle, a testimony waiting to unfold, and a story of God's glory ready to be written. God's nature has always been to demonstrate his ability in ways that surpass human expectation. From creation to redemption, from deliverance to restoration, his actions prove that the impossible is merely an invitation to witness his greatness. Every obstacle, delay, and impossibility we face is a chance for God to display his unmatched power, to teach us reliance on him, and to show that nothing is impossible for those who believe. As we live in this truth, we begin to see challenges not as barriers, but as opportunities for divine intervention. Remind us that God specializes in turning impossibilities into realities, and reasons to place unwavering trust in his perfect plan. Faithful persistence in prayer invites divine intervention. Prayer is not a one-time act or a simple utterance of words. It is a sustained conversation with the creator of the universe, a continual reaching out to the one who sees, knows, and holds all things in his hands. When life becomes overwhelming, when challenges seem insurmountable, and when every human solution has failed, prayer remains the bridge that connects our limitations to God's unlimited power. Persistent prayer is not about repeating the same words mechanically. It is about cultivating a heart that refuses to give up, a spirit that clings to hope, and a faith that refuses to be shaken by circumstances. It is through this faithfulness in prayer that God's intervention is often manifested, turning hopeless situations into testimonies of his mercy, power, and love. Throughout Scripture, examples abound of those who experienced the power of persistent prayer. The prophet Daniel, for instance, did not cease in his devotion, even in the face of mortal danger. Despite the threat of the lion's den, despite the decree that no one could pray to any god but the king, Daniel remained faithful in his communication with God. His persistence was not driven by fear, but by trust. And God's intervention came powerfully, shutting the mouths of the lions and preserving his servant. This demonstrates a vital principle. Persistence in prayer invites God's hand to move where human efforts cannot. It creates a spiritual momentum, a divine alignment, and an atmosphere where God's miraculous intervention can take place. Prayer is both an act of faith and a discipline of the soul. The act of returning again and again to God, even when answers seem delayed, strengthens the believer's relationship with him. Persistence in prayer is a declaration that we trust God's timing, that we believe in his wisdom, and that we recognize our dependence on him. It is an acknowledgement that we cannot solve every problem on our own, and that his power is greater than any challenge we face. The widow who persistently approached the unjust judge is another example of how persistent prayer can yield results. She refused to accept injustice, continued to seek intervention, and through her persistence, she obtained justice. Her story illustrates that persistent prayer is not just about asking. It is about unwavering expectation and tenacious faith. Faithful persistence in prayer also cultivates patience, humility, and perseverance. It teaches the believer to wait on God, to trust his timing, and to rely not on human effort, but on divine power. Each prayer uttered with faith becomes a spiritual seed planted in the soil of heaven, a seed that grows silently, unseen, until the moment God brings it to fruition. In moments of waiting, when answers are delayed, persistence keeps the heart engaged, the faith alive, and the hope burning. It prevents discouragement from taking root and ensures that the believer remains aligned with God's will. Even when the natural senses suggest otherwise, the power of persistent prayer is not limited by circumstance, time, or the magnitude of the challenge. Whether it is a personal struggle, a family crisis, a financial burden, or a spiritual battle, faithful prayer invites divine attention and action. The Apostle Paul, while imprisoned and facing relentless opposition, continued in prayer, interceding for the growth and protection of the church. His persistence demonstrates that even in dire circumstances, consistent prayer activates divine resources and opens doors that human wisdom cannot. Persistent prayer is like a key that unlocks spiritual doors, an engine that drives divine intervention, and a channel through which God's power flows into the life of the believer. Moreover, faithful persistence in prayer aligns the heart with God's purposes. It is not merely about presenting requests, but about seeking His will, understanding His plan, and submitting to His sovereignty. Persistent prayer refines the believer's character, transforms motives, and cultivates a deeper intimacy with the Lord. As we continue to bring our concerns, desires, and petitions before God, we learn to listen for His guidance, discern His direction, and trust His wisdom. The alignment of our hearts with God's purposes increases the effectiveness of prayer, making it a powerful instrument for inviting divine intervention and manifesting miracles in every area of life. Prayer also serves as a defense against discouragement, doubt, and spiritual attacks. Persistent prayer strengthens the believer's faith, fortifies the spirit, and provides a constant reminder that God is at work, even when circumstances appear bleak. It establishes a rhythm of dependence on God, a practice of acknowledging His sovereignty, and a habit of entrusting every situation to His care. In a world filled with uncertainty, faithful persistence in prayer becomes a source of stability, hope, and confidence, knowing that God is attentive, responsive, and capable of intervening in ways that surpass human understanding. History and personal testimonies testify to the transformative power of persistent prayer. Countless individuals have experienced breakthroughs, healings, reconciliations, and provision through the consistent act of returning to God in prayer. Persistent prayer does not guarantee instant answers, but it guarantees that the believer remains connected to the source of life, power, and wisdom. Each prayer is a spiritual conversation, a declaration of trust, and an act of faith that invites God to intervene, redirect circumstances, and bring about results that exceed expectation. Faithful persistence in prayer is also a reflection of love and devotion to God. It shows that the believer values the relationship above convenience, that the heart seeks communion over mere outcomes, and that trust in God's character surpasses human impatience. This devotion pleases God, draws His attention, and sets the stage for supernatural intervention. When the believer refuses to give up, continues to intercede, and remains steadfast in prayer, it demonstrates a faith that God honors, a trust that He responds to, and a heart that aligns with His eternal purposes. The principle of persistence is further illustrated in the ministry of Jesus. He often withdrew to pray, even when His schedule was demanding, the crowds pressing, and the needs around Him urgent. His persistence in prayer reveals the importance of continuous communion with God, not only as a source of personal strength, but also as a means of inviting divine intervention in the lives of others. By modeling faithful persistence, Jesus showed that prayer is not passive but active, not occasional but consistent, and not superficial but deeply relational. Persistent prayer also fosters a mindset of hope and expectancy. It trains the believer to anticipate God's intervention, to expect His favor, and to remain confident that no situation is beyond His power. This expectancy transforms how challenges are approached, how obstacles are faced, and how life is navigated. Rather than succumbing to despair or resignation, the believer who prays persistently remains vigilant, hopeful, and steadfast, fully aware that each prayer contributes to the unfolding of God's perfect plan. Furthermore, persistent prayer teaches dependence on God rather than self-reliance. It reminds the believer that human wisdom, effort, and strategy are limited, and that ultimate solutions come from a divine source. By continually returning to God in prayer, the believer acknowledges the insufficiency of their own understanding, submits to God's guidance, and allows His power to work unhindered. This dependence is not a sign of weakness, but a demonstration of strength, as it positions the believer to experience the fullness of God's intervention and provision. Faithful persistence in prayer also has a communal impact. Intercessory prayer, offered consistently and with faith, can bring about breakthroughs for families, communities, and nations. When believers unite in persistent prayer, their collective faith amplifies the call for divine intervention. Scripture encourages us to lift one another in prayer, to bear one another's burdens, and to persist on behalf of others, knowing that God responds to the cries of those who trust Him. The ripple effect of persistent prayer can bring healing, restoration, and transformation on a scale far greater than individual effort alone. Persistence in prayer is not a measure of intensity alone. It is an expression of relationship, trust, and unwavering faith. It demonstrates that the believer is committed to seeking God, reliant on His wisdom, and expectant of His intervention. Through persistent prayer, hearts are transformed, circumstances are aligned, and God's power is invited into the natural realm. It becomes a sacred dialogue, a spiritual exercise, and a lifestyle that positions the believer to experience miraculous breakthroughs and divine favor that surpasses human expectation. Every act of faithful persistence in prayer carries weight in the spiritual realm. It establishes a connection between heaven and earth, opens doors for divine strategies, and activates God's power in ways that human effort cannot replicate. The believer who prays consistently with unwavering faith and relentless devotion becomes a channel for God's intervention, a vessel for his purposes, and a recipient of his miraculous workings. Persistent prayer invites God to step into the impossible, to alter outcomes, and to bring about results that defy human understanding. In practice, persistent prayer involves discipline, focus, and intentionality. It requires setting aside distractions, prioritizing time with God, and approaching him with sincerity and expectation. It demands returning to him again and again, despite delays, setbacks, or unanswered prayers. The believer who embraces this discipline experiences a deepening of faith, an expansion of spiritual insight, and a growing awareness of God's presence and power. Each prayer strengthens the connection with the Creator, fortifies the spirit, and creates an environment where divine intervention can flourish. Through persistent prayer, the believer also develops resilience. Challenges that once seemed overwhelming become manageable as faith grows, hope strengthens, and trust in God deepens. The act of continual prayer equips the heart to endure trials, confront adversity, and navigate complex circumstances with confidence. It reinforces the understanding that God's timing is perfect, his methods are flawless, and his power is sufficient for every need. Each moment of persistence in prayer lays a foundation for breakthroughs, blessings, and transformations that would otherwise remain beyond reach. Faithful persistence in prayer is ultimately a partnership with God. It is a recognition that while human effort has limits, God's power is infinite. By remaining steadfast, returning to him in faith, and seeking his guidance consistently, the believer invites divine action, aligns with his purposes, and positions themselves to witness miracles unfold. Prayer is the channel, persistence is the key, and faith is the force that unlocks divine intervention, bringing the impossible into the realm of possibility, transforming lives and demonstrating the power and glory of God in ways that surpass human understanding. God's timing and power surpass human understanding. Often, we approach life with a sense of urgency, expecting solutions to come according to our schedule and anticipating outcomes based on our own understanding of what is possible. We measure success by deadlines, productivity, and visible results. Yet God operates beyond the constraints of time and the limitations of human logic. His timing is perfect, his plans are flawless, and his power is limitless. There are moments when we cannot comprehend why things are delayed or why circumstances unfold differently than expected. But these moments are opportunities to trust in a power greater than our own, a wisdom deeper than we can fathom, and a love that orchestrates every detail for our ultimate good. Throughout history, God has demonstrated repeatedly that his timing and power are beyond human grasp. From the creation of the universe to the fulfillment of promises in Scripture, every act of God reveals a deliberate orchestration that surpasses human reasoning. The stories of Abraham waiting decades for the promise of Isaac, Joseph enduring betrayal and imprisonment before rising to influence nations, and David facing years of trials before ascending to kingship, all point to a principle. God's timing is intentional, precise, and sovereign. Each delay, each moment of apparent waiting is a space where God prepares, refines, and positions events according to his will. Understanding this principle transforms how believers perceive challenges, setbacks, and unanswered prayers, allowing them to approach life with patience, trust, and confidence. God's power is equally beyond comprehension. While human effort can accomplish much, it is limited by physical, emotional, and intellectual boundaries. God's power, however, knows no limits. He moves mountains, calms storms, heals the sick, and restores what is lost. His authority is absolute, and his strength is sufficient for every challenge. Human understanding may struggle to see solutions, but divine power is always at work behind the scenes, orchestrating outcomes that align with his purposes. When believers place their trust in God, they tap into a force that transcends circumstance, defies logic, and surpasses natural expectations. Faith plays a critical role in aligning with God's timing and power. To wait for God's intervention requires trust, perseverance, and patience. It requires the believer to relinquish control, surrender personal expectations, and submit to divine wisdom. Faith is the bridge between uncertainty and assurance, between human limitation and divine capability. Even when circumstances seem contrary, when the path appears unclear, and when patience is tested, faith allows believers to trust that God is working behind the scenes. The persistent trust of the faithful brings God's timing and power into alignment with human need, producing outcomes that reflect his glory, mercy, and wisdom. The natural mind often struggles to understand why events do not unfold according to personal desires. Delays, failures, and setbacks are seen as obstacles rather than opportunities. Yet, these moments are precisely where God's timing and power are most evident. When we pause, reflect, and trust, we begin to see that every delay has a purpose, every setback is temporary, and every challenge is an opportunity for divine intervention. The power of God is not limited by our impatience. His timing is not bound by our expectations. What may seem late or impossible from a human perspective is precisely on schedule in God's perfect plan. Prayer is the conduit through which believers engage with God's timing and power. Persistent and faithful prayer aligns the heart with divine will, opens channels for supernatural intervention, and strengthens trust in God's sovereignty. Prayer teaches dependence, nurtures patience, and cultivates resilience. Through prayer, the believer comes to recognize that while human understanding is finite, God's wisdom is infinite, and his capacity to act exceeds every limitation. The more we engage in prayer, the more we align with God's timing and become vessels for his powerful intervention in every area of life. God's timing often involves preparation and refinement. Challenges, waiting periods, and trials serve to develop character, deepen faith, and position believers for the fullness of his blessings. Joseph's time in prison, David's years as a shepherd, and the Israelites' journey in the wilderness are examples of periods where divine timing was essential for ultimate purpose. These periods were not wasted. They were integral to the manifestation of God's power. In every circumstance, God's timing ensures that events unfold with precision. His plans come to fruition fully and his glory is revealed unmistakably. Recognizing that God's timing and power surpass human understanding invites believers to approach life with humility, patience, and trust. It requires releasing control, letting go of worry, and relying on the certainty of God's wisdom. When faced with trials, delays, or unanswered questions, the believer who trusts in God's perfect timing finds peace, hope, and assurance that everything is unfolding according to his divine plan. Human limitations may create frustration, but divine timing and omnipotent power transform obstacles into opportunities, setbacks into lessons, and waiting periods into moments of preparation for unprecedented breakthroughs. By understanding the supremacy of God's timing and the boundlessness of his power, believers gain perspective, resilience, and confidence in every situation. They learn that no circumstance is too complex, no delay is accidental, and no challenge is beyond God's reach. Trusting in God's timing ensures that actions, answers, and breakthroughs occur at the perfect moment, guided by his infinite wisdom and executed through his limitless power. Believers are invited to step into this reality, to trust without reservation, and to embrace the certainty that God's timing is perfect and his power is unparalleled. Surrendering every challenge to God unlocks breakthroughs. Life constantly presents obstacles, trials, and uncertainties that weigh heavily on the human heart. Often, we attempt to navigate these challenges through our own understanding, relying on human strategies, intellect, or effort. Yet, no matter how capable we believe ourselves to be, there are limits to what we can achieve alone. True breakthroughs occur when we release our grip on situations and place them fully into the hands of God. Acknowledging his sovereignty, wisdom, and power, surrender is not a sign of weakness, but an act of faith, a declaration that we recognize God as the ultimate source of solutions, and a conscious choice to trust his timing and plan. Surrender requires humility. It demands that we admit our limitations, acknowledge our dependence on God, and lay aside pride, control, and self-reliance. When we surrender our challenges, we are essentially saying that we can no longer carry the weight alone and that we trust God to act on our behalf. This act of humility opens the door for divine intervention. Just as the psalmist declares that God lifts the humble and exalts those who trust in him, surrender becomes the key that activates breakthroughs beyond human imagination. By relinquishing control, we align ourselves with God's will and create the space for him to orchestrate outcomes that are far greater than anything we could achieve on our own. Faith is inseparable from surrender. To hand over our challenges to God, we must believe in his goodness, trust in his wisdom, and rely on his power. Faith is the assurance that God is at work even when circumstances appear chaotic, the confidence that he can bring order to confusion, and the certainty that no situation is too complex for his intervention. Persistent faith combined with the willingness to surrender positions the believer to experience breakthroughs that defy logic, overcome limitations, and transform life in profound ways. Faith transforms surrender from a passive act into an active engagement with God's power. Surrendering challenges also involves letting go of anxiety, worry, and the need to control outcomes. Often, the human heart is burdened by fear of the unknown, uncertainty about the future, and frustration over delays. These emotions hinder breakthroughs because they keep us tethered to our own understanding rather than God's infinite wisdom. By surrendering completely, we release these burdens and trust our circumstances to God and allow His peace and guidance to prevail. When the heart is free from anxiety and the mind is aligned with divine purpose, breakthroughs naturally follow as God's power operates unhindered in situations where human effort has failed. The examples of Scripture illustrate the power of surrender in unlocking divine breakthroughs. Moses surrendered the leadership of Israel to God, trusting Him to guide the people through the wilderness and part the Red Sea. David, when pursued by enemies, placed his life and kingdom in God's hands, trusting in divine protection and justice. Jesus Himself demonstrated perfect surrender, committing every aspect of His mission to the Father and relying fully on God's guidance. Each of these examples highlights a principle. Surrender is not passive resignation, but active trust that opens the door to miraculous outcomes, divine protection, and victory over challenges that would otherwise seem insurmountable. Surrender also transforms perspective. When we release control to God, we begin to see challenges differently. What once appeared as insurmountable becomes an opportunity for growth, faith, and testimony. Surrender shifts focus from human limitation to divine possibility. It allows the believer to recognize that every obstacle carries within it the potential for God's glory to manifest, that every setback is a setup for breakthrough, and that every difficulty is an avenue for God to demonstrate His power. This perspective fosters patience, perseverance, and unwavering trust, essential qualities for experiencing transformative breakthroughs. Prayer, worship, and obedience are critical components of surrender. Through these spiritual practices, the believer actively engages with God, aligns with His will, and positions themselves to receive His intervention. Persistent prayer communicates dependence and expectation. Worship fosters intimacy and trust. And obedience demonstrates alignment with God's purposes. Together, these acts create the conditions for breakthroughs, allowing God's power to flow into situations that human effort alone cannot resolve. Surrender is both relational and practical. It requires the heart to trust, the mind to believe, and the spirit to remain aligned with divine guidance. Surrendering every challenge to God also involves patience. Breakthroughs rarely occur on human schedules. Timing is in God's hands, and faith requires waiting without wavering. The act of surrender does not eliminate challenges immediately, but places them in the hands of one who can transform every situation according to His wisdom. While waiting, the believer grows in character, strength, and resilience, preparing to receive the full manifestation of the breakthrough when God chooses to act. The combination of surrender, trust, and patience creates a spiritual environment where miracles, restoration, and divine solutions are able to manifest fully and powerfully. When we truly surrender our challenges to God, we release the limitations of human effort and open ourselves to divine possibilities. Every problem, trial, or obstacle becomes a conduit for His power to operate. Surrender invites God's wisdom, aligns our hearts with His will, and positions us to experience outcomes that surpass human expectation. It is through surrender that the believer moves from striving in their own strength to resting in the assurance of God's intervention, transforming struggles into testimonies and ordinary circumstances into extraordinary breakthroughs.